My last video on writing mistakes to avoid was pretty well received, and I'm not one to shy away from talking more about a topic which can be endlessly spoken about. It's fun to talk about pet peeves and personal gripes, but this time I wanted to take a step back and approach this from a more objective angle. A lot of people critiqued the last video for being more about pet peeves and using too many anime examples. And that makes a lot of sense because the original concept of the video was actually more about pet peeves than writing mistakes that you should avoid. It's just that more people like to click on mistakes to avoid than they like to click on a video about some dude yapping about personal gripes and pet peeves. But I wanted to make this one a bit more of a skill building video than the scathing criticism video that the last one was. After all, there are a great deal of worlds and settings, all of which can be done correctly or incorrectly without really having a negative or positive effect on the rest of the story as a whole. World building is a very interesting subject in writing because, although it is very important, someone can have terrible world building in their story, but that same story can be critically acclaimed or beloved by many people. For example, even if I could critique the world building of Harry Potter and all its contrivances and inconsistencies, I don't think that would make anyone's opinion of the story sour. Sure, our opinions of the author may incentivize us to take a more critical look at the story we've read, but let's not pretend like the book series was not beloved in its time. And while I don't think popularity means a story is better necessarily, I also don't think that a boring story can get popular. The key to any successful world building, and therefore successful storytelling, is that you should not bore your audience with it. Beyond the consistency, detailed thought, fleshed out cultures, histories, power systems, and politics you put into your world, the key goal to your world building is to make a story which is engaging. It can be anything from a story which everybody absolutely hates, or it can be a stunning masterpiece which everyone praises. Regardless, it should not be boring. And I would say that's a very important lesson to learn for not only how you write your stories, but also how you better yourself as a human being. Much of our own progression as human beings is similar to how we might invent and flesh out our worlds. We can often choose to sit around doing nothing and think about how cool it would be if we could draw or write a book or make music, only to just sit around rotting away doing nothing and focusing on meaningless things which no one, even ourselves, care about outside of short-lived thrills. Life is what you make of it, and there is no better investment of your money and time than learning a new skill and breaking out of your everyday routine. So hear me out when I say this, because there is no time better than the present moment to make those changes. That's why I'm working together with today's sponsor, Skillshare. With Skillshare, you can take this opportunity to invest in yourself, and there is no better time than right now. As most of you know, one of the pieces of advice I repeat most on this channel is that learning a new skill can not only make you a happier and more confident person, it can also open doors which you didn't even know existed. Skillshare is the largest online learning community for creatives with thousands of classes led by industry experts across film, illustration, design, freelance productivity, and more. Skillshare can help you take your career, skills, hobbies, passions, or side hustles to the next level. For me, I'm always looking to improve my writing, but I don't always know how to go about it. That's why I'm personally interested in taking Lincoln Michelle's class, Science Fiction and Fantasy, Creating Unique and Powerful Worlds, so that I have some practice to hone my skills on world building. But Skillshare doesn't just stop at writing. There are film classes, art and animation, design, and even classes which can help you start your own business. And if you've seen Skillshare around but haven't used them, then right now is the best time to start, because Skillshare doesn't just help you improve, they've been improving themselves. They've added smarter class categories, new topics like creative careers and creative inspiration, as well as the ability to find classes by software and material. They will tailor your experience towards your unique goals as a creative and provide the best classes for you to take. Guys, I know a lot of you are probably back in school by now, and while most education doesn't teach you things that you're actually interested in, Skillshare can be a fantastic opportunity and tool to learn something that you're passionate about. The first 500 people to use my link on screen and in the description will receive a 1-month free trial of Skillshare. So get started today. That's 1 month to learn something you will use for the rest of your life. So invest in yourself with Skillshare. Anyways, back to the video. Welcome back, everyone who skipped the ad read. If you happen to be a writer who wanted to improve on writing, then I think you might have missed a good opportunity just now. Oh well, I guess your dreams can wait. Let's talk about Harry Potter some more. To use my prior example of Harry Potter, nothing truly makes sense in the world of Harry Potter if you really break down its world building. Owls being used as messengers is nonsensical in a world where teens and young adults can learn how to teleport as if they are getting a driver's license. Trains, magic powder that makes flying cars, beasts with wings, none of that makes any sense when every wizard is capable of learning how to teleport at seemingly no cost to themselves. Beyond that, there are also questions about why Slytherin still exists as a house if they're so problematic, or what sort of jobs wizards have in a society beyond being either a cop or a student. I could make an entire video about how bad Harry Potter's world building is, but that would not change the fact that it still managed to become a critically acclaimed series with millions of rabid fans around the world. An entire generation of people love Harry Potter, my younger self included. That is to say that a story can be well liked and critically acclaimed even if the world building doesn't make any sense, or even if it's just poorly done. The truth about world building and writing good world building is that the only bad world building is world building which bores the reader or overstays its welcome. So when we're talking about writing good world building in our stories, our first priority and our main goal should be to find what is interesting about our worlds to begin with. And before people misunderstand what I'm saying, no, I'm not telling you that a consistent and thoughtfully crafted world is useless. I'm saying that we need to remember what our goals are as writers when it comes to writing our stories. We need to frame our world in an interesting context and only build it when it's relevant and interesting for the story and characters. Harry Potter's world building might not be the best world building, but it does its job, and it doesn't overstay its welcome. In fact, I think it's often conveyed so well that Rowling manages to instill a sense of escapism in the reader. While reading Harry Potter, you want to live in its world, and I think that is a sign of effective world building. Anyone who read the books or watched the movies growing up wanted to become a student at Hogwarts and cast spells. Never mind the fact that a clock would probably be more effective than forbidden magics, or that wizards don't use their magic to help the world in any meaningful way, when they very well could. It just feels cool to think that there's a hidden society of magic lying just beneath our everyday life, a world bursting with zany adventures and wondrous things. The Percy Jackson series would be another very similar example to this. Camp Half-Blood is a cool place to be, and it's a cool escapist fantasy which blends modern life and Greek fantasy together. However, the more you really think about the world building, especially with the introduction of spin-off series involving gods from Egypt and Norse mythology, the world building really doesn't make any sense at all. The main reason I'm harping on this point, before going into some more detailed advice about deepening your world, is because I want to avoid what's known as world builder's disease. World builder's disease is what is most commonly struggled with writers, and it's why I'm stopping you here right and now, because it's the first problem you're going to encounter when making your world. World builder's disease is basically when you, as the writer, are too caught up writing all the intricate, minute details of your world that you avoid actually writing your story with it. The end goal of world building should be to provide context to the story that you actually tell. It should not be a substitute or something which you flesh out entirely before beginning your story. Many writers will make up lore, mythological origins, and other things which will never be relevant to the story simply because they think they have to, or because it's easier than actually coming up with a proper story and plot. So when I tell you that successful world building has less to do with figuring out all the minute details of your world and more to do with finding what makes your world interesting to yourself and others, I genuinely mean it. And sometimes, while writing the story and your characters, You will discover new things about your world which you did not consider when you first started writing about it. The story itself can inform your world building and help you explore that world just as much as sitting down and writing some lore in a separate document can. There are some things you need in your world which you will not think about until you need to use it as a plot device for your story. And this brings me to my next point, which is to avoid writing characters who don't feel as if they live in the world that you've created for them. This can take the form of things like a fantasy world with a bunch of characters who use very trendy slang for seemingly no reason at all. Sure, this sort of thing can work, but a lot of the time, someone saying poggers in a medieval fantasy world will likely stomp the shit out of any immersion your audience had. This can also be the case for a character who should seemingly know a lot about your world building details just by virtue of growing up and living in your world. But they just don't. There are a lot of characters who have no reason to ask about certain historical events or magical powers. Typically, in a story, in order to convey the world building, many writers will do one of two things. They will either make it so that the information which must be conveyed to the reader and the characters is canonically information which is not common knowledge, or they will make the character who is asking questions an unknowing dumbass in the group. Although, to be fair to the unknowing dumbass of the group, asking questions is actually a sign of intelligence. Assuming you know the answer to something and locking yourself into that answer is actually a sign of true stupidity. An unwillingness to learn is not intelligence, it's foolishness. Digressions aside, these two methods are often meant to be ways in which information is conveyed to the reader. Usually we have a mentor or a knowledgeable character to explain everything to our main characters as well as the audience. However, there are other ways for our characters to convey world building without having to fill the mentor role. Oftentimes, writers will forget to have their characters convey the common knowledge of their world to the audience as though it were common knowledge to them, having dialogue which assumes that somebody already knows what they're talking about. Instead of using an idiot character as a crutch, we can convey a lot more just by the way people speak and act, as well as the assumptions they make with their dialogue. For example, if a character says, "Hey, you see that gnome over there? Yeah, he told a bunch of dwarves their pies taste like dirt, and now he ain't got no legs." That is a single line of dialogue which establishes something without anybody else having to ask a question in the story. The first thing we learn as the audience just from that single line of dialogue is that gnomes and dwarves exist in this world. We also know that dwarves will take grave and violent offense to an insult on their cooking. My advice is to use these types of things to spice up your story. Allow your readers to fill in some information with context clues and try to figure out how much information you can organically convey to the audience without ever asking questions in dialogue. I could replace gnome and dwarf with anything in this context too, even a species or race which most people are not fully familiar with yet. Just understand that sometimes it does need to be established that the characters are talking about a type of creature or humanoid race if it is not something which exists in most other stories of the genre. Basically, when you're world building, you should tell small stories. Give little glimpses of what your characters know and consider to be normal in your world. It'll make both the world and your characters a lot more enjoyable to read about. Speaking of taking grave offense, however, I do take grave offense whenever writers refuse to entertain ideas which might help improve their world building. This is more of a meta critique on my end. I've seen it with a lot of writers who I have attempted to give critique to in the past. Now, to be clear, I don't think it's very productive for anyone to try and mold someone else's story into something that they themselves would prefer. When I give criticism to another writer, I am less concerned with getting them to make a story that I would like to read, and more concerned with helping them write the best version of their story. By the way, if you want to join my channel memberships, I will critique your writing for a modest sum of $10 to $30. Those prices might go up in the future as more people buy it and I am less able to keep up with the volume of critiques I need to make. So act now if you want to have me take a look at your stuff. The join button is below, so join now. Anyways, when I give criticism, I'm usually asking questions which are meant to get the writer to think a little bit more about their world building. If the writer has an answer to my questions, that's great. It means they thought of that stuff and that they're prepared to answer it. From there, it's just a matter of figuring out how and when to convey that world building in the story itself. If the writer does not have an answer, however, that's also fine. But I will often encourage them to find that answer because I think it will make their stories more engaging. What tends to happen, however, is that some writers will see the question I put in front of them and purposefully ignore it. Now, it's fine to ignore certain questions and critiques when it comes to taking criticism or making your world. However, I also think it's a missed opportunity in most instances. If I ask what the reason for something in your world building is, or have a lot of questions with no answers when it comes to a specific part of the world building, chances are that the world building in question would be served well by some deeper thought. For my own book, I used to avoid this topic of my character's parents and how the society came to separate them from my main character. It was mainly just a vague setup of, this character was protected as a baby and dropped on an old man's doorstep after his father died to protect him. It's not a bad way to establish the story, but for the longest time it became a personal obstruction to a better story. I only viewed it as a convenient method to set up my main character's edgy backstory, and thought that the mystery would be intriguing for the audience. The problem is that I never gave the audience a reason to care nor get invested in the situation my main character was in. Oh no, he's an orphan. Big whoop, who cares? Why is the mother gone? I don't fucking know. Who cares? He's just edgy and grew up without parents. The problem with that is, as a reader, why would I ask what happened to his mother when we don't even know who his mother is as a character? It's a similar case to how we don't usually care about Ash Ketchum's father in Pokemon, or in any of the Pokemon games for that matter. Sure, after the fact we might ask that question, but oftentimes we're not given a very good or satisfying answer, simply because there never is one presented to us in Pokemon for the most part. It's a mystery, sure, but it's not exactly an intriguing or gripping mystery. It's not even a question that's posed or anything in the top 100 things that I would enjoy about the Pokemon series as a whole. So in this instance, I was actually given a critique from a family member who asked me all the right questions. They gave me a tough pill to swallow about the story I had written, and in taking that pill, I came up with something I am endlessly proud of. Zesa Eric, whose artwork is currently my most well-liked community post on the channel, is the mother of my main character, Drakey Eric. She's what's known as a Venator Knight in my world, which is a low-born warrior who seeks to establish a noble clan through military service. When a Venator Knight has their firstborn child, they are given exactly 10 years of leave to take care of their children before they must return to military service or have their rank as a knight stripped from them. Normally in Zeosian society, this would not be much of an issue because they are a generally polyamorous race with numerous sister wives and brother husbands who can raise the children instead. However, the nobility in the world of Ataro does not exactly like the idea of a lowborn establishing a new noble clan which can compete with their own. So, oftentimes, the established nobility will challenge Venator Knights like Zesa Eric to duels for their titles. They will often wager their mark and their loyalty, but sometimes it can be considered an offer of courtship. Basically, if I win, you become my mistress. For Zeosians, duels are not often fatal affairs due to their healing factors as a species, which are strong enough to regrow limbs. In order to harm a Zeosian more permanently, or outright kill them, one must channel magic into their blades to make cuts linger. In essence, having a scar is considered a badge of honor because it means you are the victor of a deadly duel. And there is no greater honor than to die in battle in Zeosian society. For Zesa, every scar you see on her body is from a noble who challenged her to a death match. but only the stronger nobles were the ones who actually managed to leave a mark. This is one example of world building which I came up with after I finally got out of my own way and bothered to answer some of the questions I tried to avoid in my story. In answering these questions, it also gave me a more solid reason for why my main character must hide away from nobility and grow stronger. The noble houses of Itaro are just as likely to try and kidnap the children of Venator Knights and hold them hostage as they are to challenge a Venator Knight to a duel and bring them under their thumb. In fact, it is proven to be the safer option for many of the nobility, considering Zesa Eric has never allowed a noble to live during a duel. So in answering this question, I've just now established politics, a unique military system, and an even more fleshed out power system due to how it made me ponder questions about what nobility actually was in my world. Before I start exposition dumping on what soul marks are in my story though, I'm going to move on to my next point. Some of you might have drawn a blank while I yapped about my book's world for a second. Heck, some of you might have clicked off the video. That's because while I find the information interesting, I also ended up dumping a ton of information and lore on you for the sake of an example. That's what happens when you world build too fast. I can go on and on and on about the politics and power systems of my book world in this video, but I have a feeling that my retention rate would look something like a massive hockey stick if I did so, because most people have neither read my book nor clicked on this video to hear me yap about it. However, the information I've just given you in the past few minutes is actually conveyed over the course of several chapters in my book. It is drip-fed to the audience because I am more concerned with telling the actual story that takes place in the book rather than info dumping about my character's backstory and the world around them. Some of the information I just gave you about Zesa is not fully conveyed until about 10 to 15 chapters in, because as interesting as the world building and lore of your setting might be, it should have an effect on your characters regardless of whether or not the audience knows about it. Writers will often world build too quickly because they mistake world building to be the most important part of their story. Oftentimes, writing massive blocks of text to narrate and explain how something functions in their world, answering questions no one was actually asking in the first place. This usually takes place during the introduction of the story. The author makes the mistake of cramming as much detail and explanation as possible, as if they are giving a 101 class on their story's world. There's a level of insecurity which radiates off this type of writing. It paints the picture of an author who thinks that their world and story cannot retain the attention of their viewers if they do not convey all of the neat and unique things that their world has to offer as quickly as possible. My advice is to recognize that people are not here to read about your world building. They are here to read about the story, not the setting. Allow some of your questions about the setting and the world to linger in the reader's mind, and learn to recognize what questions your audience might actually be asking before giving them an answer. If you can get the reader to ask a question about your world, it makes answering the question all the more satisfying to them. However, if they've never pondered that question, then the answer is not really all that relevant to them most of the time. If the reader's not asking any questions and you are answering those questions anyway, consider making the answer as concise as possible. Some of us might be thinking, but I want to write a fast-paced story. I don't have time to let questions linger. Or, I want to write a slow-paced story. I've got more than enough time to yap about my world to the reader. And I hear you. I see you. That's not a counter to what I'm trying to say. The simple truth about pacing and world building is that it's purely vibes-based, and how much you're able to get your audience to care about what they're reading. If it feels like I'm being sat down to listen to a boring lecture, it's poorly done slow pacing. If it feels like I'm listening to someone yap about gossip I have zero context for, it's poorly done fast pacing. In both instances, I was never made to care about what's being told to us because I have not been given a reason to care. Your world building and the ways you choose to convey it can be the difference between good and bad pacing, no matter how slow or fast you seek to make the pacing in the first place. Pacing is less about speed and more about rhythm. If you have to yank a person off beat to quickly explain how your world and your power system works, then it's bad pacing. So when I say this advice, it's able to be universally applied regardless of whether or not you want to tell a fast story or a slow story. It's not something which you can simply excuse or ignore for one reason or another because it fits your subjective tastes as a writer better. All types of writing can be benefited by this idea. Take your time to build your world organically, and only do so when the information is necessary and relevant for understanding the plot and characters within your story. This brings me to my next point about world building, and that's to use characters less as guides for your world and more as fellow passengers for your audience. Now, you might be thinking, didn't you just say that I should avoid using idiot characters as a crutch for world building? And yes, I did say that, and I still stand by it. However, this advice is not mutually exclusive to the previous advice. As with anything in writing, there is a balance to be struck. When it comes to your characters and the world they live in, it is important to consider what your characters know about and what they do not know about. If something is common knowledge, then convey it through dialogue and action. If something is not common knowledge, you do not always need to have a guide or a mentor explain what it is. Sometimes you can have the character in question discover that knowledge and ponder it with the reader. For example, when you put an anomaly in front of the characters of your story, it provides a good opportunity to reinforce the fundamental ideas, understandings, and concepts of your world. Often when we are trying to unpack something new, we try to review what we know. We look up the definitions of words, we list off things we currently understand, and then we ponder the contradictions and questions this new piece of information has left us. In doing so, we can have the character both establish some fundamental truths about the world, while also leading the reader through an engaging train of thought. Once a question is pondered, worked through, and then solved, that solution sticks in our heads a lot better than if someone else had just given us the answer right away. Frieren does a great job of this when it comes to attack magic and the progression of defensive magic. I've gone into detail about this in a previous video, so to save some time, basically there's this big scary demon general who invented magic which can kill people instantly, but back 80 years ago, Frieren and her party managed to seal him away, learned his magic, taught it to the other humans in the world, and then within a few decades, the humans had developed defensive magic which can counter all the powerful attack magic that that demon had created. So by the time the demon general was unfrozen from his cryogenic sleep, his magic was pretty much useless against Frieren and her new protege Fern. However, the episode poses this event as a question and a lesson. First to Fern, who refuses to read the book Frieren gave her, and second to us, the audience. We see bits and pieces of the lesson which is being displayed to us. Frieren training Fern to use her defensive magic in an efficient way so that it does not burn away her mana too quickly. And for a moment, we, the audience, don't think much of it. However, after the demon general is slain, we understand why those scenes existed in the first place. While they were able to be understood and appreciated in the moment, they took on new meaning once we knew why those scenes were put in front of us. It was not just to establish that defensive magic takes more mana to cast than offensive magic. It was not just to show Fern being mentored by Frieren. It did those things, but it also gave us necessary context for future world building in that episode. We soon learn the origins of the defensive magic Fern was casting, as well as how and why it was created. We then see that magic fulfill its intended purpose of slaying that demon general, thus bringing that history to a satisfying conclusion, the likes of which symbolizes humanity's propensity to evolve and make progress in a short amount of time compared to the longer living races of the world. This also feeds into the themes of Frieren's story, which is discovery and making the most of the time we take for granted, all in the span of a single episode. That is what truly masterful world building looks like. It serves numerous functions simultaneously. If you ever wonder why your pacing feels off, or why it feels like you cannot convey everything you want to about your world in a short time, this is why. It's because you're not finding ways to do things simultaneously. There is such a thing as saying a lot with very little. And this transitions beautifully to my next point, which is that you should use your world building as an opportunity to create allegories for the themes and symbols in your stories. Or rather, utilize allegories for the sake of both building your world and reinforcing the themes, characters, and symbolic meaning of your story. And for those in the comments section who might want to say they need a definition of an allegory, I'll tell you that I've literally given you several allegories in the past few minutes. Allegories are just stories which can be interpreted to reveal hidden meaning. They can tell the basic story which you can understand and appreciate on its own, and then you can look deeper to appreciate a second story or lesson from it. I just gave you the allegory which Frieren used to establish key details about their world, as well as the interpretation of that allegory. So, when you're world building, consider what types of allegories you can tell in order to convey all of these things at once, instead of sectioning things off into exposition and character writing. Let it meld together and allow the story to be appreciated on its own. That is what confident writing looks like. That's also what thoughtful world building looks like, not just in the details you've created in your world, but how you choose to convey those details in the story, and how you allow your audience to make their own decisions and opinions about it. Because another point I want to hit on about mistakes people make about world building is that they avoid putting that extra level of care into what they've made. If your world building is only meant to be the background, and you don't think about it too often, then that shows a lack of care. If your world building is the only thing you care about, and you've neglected to care about telling the rest of the story, then that is also displaying a lack of care. If you don't care about conveying your story and your world to the audience, then what reason does the audience have to care about all the cool details you've spent days fleshing out? If you want your audience to care more about the world you've built, then you should care equally about the world you're building, as well as how you choose to convey that world to the people consuming what you've written. No one is saying that you need to hold the audience's hand and ensure that they capture and understand every single detail of your story. However, I am saying that a lack of care can bleed through in the quality of your writing and your story. And this brings me to my next point, which is to avoid thinking too much about the broad and irrelevant details about your world. No one needs to know that the world was created by some elder deity who was born from the void. No one needs to see conflict between two countries which are irrelevant to the story and we care nothing about. Give the audience a reason to care by narrowing the scope of your story down to a personal level first, and then build the world out through the lens of your protagonists. Let your characters be the ones to render out the necessary details of your world as you tell your story. It is for these same reasons that characters like Spider-Man are so beloved. They're always more personal stories where the stakes are interpersonal. Oftentimes in superhero comics, many of them will get lost in the idea that they must do bigger and better things to keep audience attention. They must pit their heroes against bigger and stronger threats for their stories to be meaningful. However, there comes a point where this damages the world building in your story, because we humans simply do not comprehend or relate to something so big in scale. Saving a city filled with characters and people that we care about is about as emotionally engaging as saving an entire world, solar system, or galaxy filled with the same characters that we care about. This principle applies to your world building just as much as your plot or characters. The broader your scope of the world is, the more difficult it is to actually care about it. I can make you care about the plight of a caterpillar more than I can make you care about an isekai protagonist saving the multiverse from a demon lord who can destroy the galaxy with a sneeze. I can make you care more about a personal fact about the world which directly affects my main characters than I can make you care about the world and how it came to be created. Use the little things in your main character's personal life to establish bigger things about your world. Establish your world building on a foundation of something which is personal. For example, the food we eat every day is something we often take for granted, but which is very personal to each and every individual in this world. But what if, in your world, food is either scarce or vastly different? Perhaps the chicken your character eats is actually lab-grown meat in a sci-fi world. Or perhaps your character marvels at a plate full of food being placed in front of them because they grew up in a place where food is scarce. Perhaps the scarcity of food can even say something about the social power structures and politics of your world, where the wealthy take all the food they can eat and waste the excess, leaving the farmers and peasants of the world to fight over these scraps in order to survive. That's world building, which tells a story from a small scope. The biggest piece of advice I can give you, and one which I have somewhat touched upon in this entire video, is to find those personal stories and allegories in your world which help you to expand it. Start from something small and personal, and figure out what that small thing says about the greater scope of your world. Remember that world building is not about the histories, power systems, and systems of power. It's about the context it grants the story you are currently trying to tell your audience. So start small, open up a new document, delve into a new world, and start writing.